Silent Hill. It's a game series that has captivated me since my childhood. Childhood, you say? Yes, I, among many others, were way too young when we were first exposed to these games. I think I was around the age of 12, and back then I didn't own a PlayStation myself. Me and my younger cousin were Nintendo boys. But occasionally the two of us would stay over at another cousin's house who lived far away. Together the three of us would play games on his PlayStation, which granted me the opportunity to experience games that under normal circumstances I would not be able to play. We finished Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3, which were already pretty intense for a 12-year-old. But then my cousin pulled out a different game, Silent Hill, and it scared us even more than Resident Evil ever did. Made by Konami and published in 1999, the game was originally intended to be a direct competitor to Resident Evil. But due to clashing ideas as well as inexperience among the development team, the game was shaped into something very different, a more deep and personal experience. The team that developed the game was dubbed Team Silent, and following the unexpected success of the first game, continued to make multiple sequels after that. I want to refrain from all the drama surrounding Konami, so long story short, eventually Team Silent got disbanded and the Silent Hill IP was handed over to Western developers who would continue the series onward. Most Silent Hill fans agree that the games developed by the original Team Silent are the golden years of Silent Hill, and the franchise has since then degraded in quality. Hence, for this analysis, I'm only focusing on the first 3 games from the Team Silent era. I'm going to exclude Silent Hill: The Room. Despite also being developed by Team Silent, it's so fundamentally different from the others, this video would pretty much double in size, but I might cover it separately in a future video. To someone who's unfamiliar with the series, it's hard to explain exactly why the Japanese titles are so much better. On a surface level, aesthetically, some of the Western-made games look rather similar to their Japanese counterparts. However, there was a shift in soul. Unlike Resident Evil, which was more in your face, Silent Hill was all about subtlety. The smallest of sounds, symbolism, and imagery that can be easily missed if you're not paying attention. The Western developers made the games a little bit more action-focused, and the monsters became less and less creative, and additionally, it also lost a lot of the symbolism that made the older games so interesting. Every monster design, visual clue, or music track was put there for a reason. I mentioned in my previous video that darkness can provide an additional challenge by disorienting the player. In that regard, welcome to Silent Hill. An area that under normal circumstance would be pretty straightforward to navigate suddenly becomes a claustrophobic maze. Even in the Overworld, you have a very limited field of view. In the original, this was initially implemented to hide some of the technical shortcomings of the PlayStation 1, and in particular the limited draw distance. The town of Silent Hill, which the series is named after, is a pretty big place, even in the first game. The streets, city blocks and squares can stretch out quite far. So to deal with this technical limitation, fog was used to mask some of these shortcomings. What this ended up doing, however, was create a very oppressive and claustrophobic atmosphere even when you're out in the open, and actually became the main staple of Silent Hill as a fog-covered town, for both the games and the movie adaptations to come. Indoors, this is amplified even further, with a field of view of perhaps only a few meters. Up until Silent Hill: The Room, that is, where you didn't even have a flashlight. So now let's get into the level design, as there's plenty to go over. When discussing Silent Hill, we have to talk atmosphere first, as this is by far the greatest strength of the series. It's what captivated me in the first place, and made it stand out from any other game I played previously. I have somewhat of a fascination for old and abandoned cities and buildings, and used to be quite the urban explorer myself. So if that's your thing, then Silent Hill will definitely strike a chord with you. Silent Hill is a ghost town. Its streets and houses, buildings, long forgotten and abandoned. You can still find many traces of former human activity scattered around the streets and the buildings. Newspapers, shopping carts, garbage bags, furniture, and more, giving off a very post-apocalyptic vibe. But most of all, as soon as you set foot onto the streets of Silent Hill, a feeling of dread hangs over you, like a dark cloud. This isn't just some regular abandoned town. One of the most prominent ways this is communicated to the player is through the use of music and ambience. There doesn't even have to be anything significant happening visually. The audio says it all. When it comes to Silent Hill's foreboding atmosphere, the sound design plays one of the most, if not the most important role. The brilliant mind behind these amazing tracks and ambient tunes is sound director Akira Yamaoka, who was present from the very first game and even continued to compose for the Western-made installments all the way up to 2012's Silent Hill Downpour, one of the last remnants of Team Silent. Yamaoka's creative experimentation stands out by the use of very industrial, percussive and weirdly distorted sound design, even going as far as to use the sound of a dentist drill during one of the boss fights. The sound of a dentist drill is of course already not very pleasant, so this creates a very unnerving feeling. When it comes to the soundtrack itself, there's also a flip side: pure silence. Silent Hill knows when to shut up. The sudden absence of music creates a great contrast, when all you hear is your own footsteps. For some of the ambient noises in the background, the team created a wide variety of randomized sounds that can play at any time and at different intervals, keeping the experience unique even after multiple playthroughs. To this day, I still sometimes discover new sounds I've never heard before. Combine all of this with the pitch-black hallways, disturbing imagery and feeling of isolation, and you have the recipe for a very effective horror experience. Since we are primarily talking about dungeon and level design as opposed to story and development history behind the games, I'm going to make some comparisons to the Legend of Zelda series. Because of its nature as a fantasy series, the temples and dungeons in those games are for the most part very quote-unquote video gamey. Even if a place is called a temple, shrine, or tower, it's hard to imagine that people actually lived here or visited these locations. Whereas Silent Hill, being more grounded in reality, its dungeons are shaped to resemble locations akin to real life. Schools, hospitals, theme parks, etc. I have no issue calling these locations dungeons. Even though the games nor the fanbase ever refers to them as such, all the characteristics are there. See if this sounds familiar. They are enclosed spaces, separate from the overworld. You can find a map to make your life a lot easier. There's locked doors, keys to collect, puzzles to solve, enemies to fight, and at the end of each one there's usually a boss fight waiting for you. These so-called dungeons in Silent Hill are perhaps less creative in terms of level design than the ones we encounter in the Zelda series, since they are more restricted to reality. This is however more fitting for a game of this genre. As a matter of fact, one of the weaknesses of some of the later games is that as soon as they start to go too crazy with some of the level designs, it starts to feel out of place. My favorite dungeon area in any of the early Silent Hill games are the hospitals. One because, well, hospitals already creep me out in real life. Amplify that with a decrepit and abandoned hospital where you can barely see your hand 2 inches from your face because of your dinky little flashlight, and man, the result is intoxicating. Getting the map to any of these areas is pretty much crucial unless you already know the game on the back of your hand. There are loads and loads of doors to try and different floors to visit. It gets confusing real quick as to which doors you've already tried and which rooms you've already checked out. On top of that, backtracking to different floors and rooms you've already visited is frequently required. But with the map at your disposal, things start to get a lot more convenient and it creates oversight. The protagonist automatically makes notes of which doors are inaccessible, which ones are locked, and other things of interest. I think I would have preferred to make my own notes, but you know, drawing on a map with an analog stick or, God forbid, a D-pad isn't really an option. Because of the advantage of the Wii Remote, drawing on your map was actually implemented in Silent Hill Shattered Memories, but ironically, the game was so easy, this was rarely ever necessary. There is one additional aspect to the dungeon designs, but I will save that for a later part of the video as it deserves its own category. I've already given you a general overview of how Silent Hill sets up a scary atmosphere, but what good would atmosphere be if there's no actual threats and scares to break the tension? This is of course where enemies come into play. One unique feature that has been present from the very first game is the radio, except for Silent Hill The Room. See what I mean with this game? Anyway, the radio is usually obtained very early in the game and serves as an indicator when enemies are close. As soon as they start to come in proximity, the radio will start emitting static. Now you would think that this ruins the suspense, but actually not that much. Even if you know that an enemy is somewhere close, you still won't be able to see it until it's already in your field of view. The static gets louder the closer the enemy is. And if you still feel like the radio is ruining your suspense, don't worry, you'll always have the option to turn it off. Silent Hill in general doesn't feature the greatest variety of enemies. Silent Hill 2, for instance, which is regarded as one of the best in the series, actually only features 6 regular enemies, not counting bosses. But what they lack in quantity, they make up for in originality. As opposed to your run-of-the-mill typical zombie, these monsters all feature very unique designs and behaviors. Monster designer Masahiro Ito strikes a great balance between humanoid designs and features that make it unrecognizable as a human, making them very unnerving. The enemy AI is nothing special, but combat isn't exactly the main focus of the series. So much so that I'm not even devoting a separate category to it. The controls are quite clunky, but this was a conscious decision by the developers. You're not meant to be a hero or a soldier that just plows its way through hordes of enemies. In fact, it's usually the best option to just avoid regular enemies as much as possible and save your ammo for the boss fights. The enemies are mostly there to contrast the desolate and lonely atmosphere in between. The boss fights themselves are hit or miss. Due to the simplistic and clunky controls, it usually doesn't come down to more than just run around, try not to get hit, all the while you study their attack pattern to land a few hits in between their moments of cooldown or vulnerability. Aesthetically, of course, they are once again very creepy and very unnerving, and in most cases masterfully designed. Even if you've never played a single Silent Hill game, there is a good chance that you will at least recognize this guy. Mechanically, the bosses are nothing special, but again, it's not that type of game where you have epic boss fights with crazy stunts involved. Next, I want to go over the puzzles. These are unlike any of the ones you will find in any Zelda game. No block pushing here, folks. These are genuine head scratchers, and some of them are notoriously hard to figure out. It also didn't help that Team Silent didn't shy away from putting some of the most difficult ones in the early game. This piano one right here, me and my cousins must have racked our brains for several hours before we were finally able to figure it out. What it comes down to is it's a poem that describes the tale of birds without a voice. By interpreting the poem correctly, you will be able to figure out which keys to press in what order. This is easier said than done, however, as the poem itself is quite cryptic. I'm not gonna give away the solution, but this is one of the earliest puzzles in the game, and I can imagine that a lot of people got stuck at this point. Starting and unfortunately also ending with Silent Hill 2 and 3, the development team made the games a little bit more accessible by including a separate riddle difficulty. The higher the difficulty, the less clues and context are given to the player. This way the games can be catered towards different types of people. Some might not enjoy head-scratching and cryptic puzzles that get you stuck for hours upon end, but they do want a challenge in terms of combat and survival, in which case they can set the action difficulty to hard and the riddle difficulty to easy, or of course vice versa. Unfortunately, every mainline game after Silent Hill 3 either had a general difficulty setting or none at all. We are already in the final stretch of the video, and not once have I ever mentioned the Otherworld, or Nightmare World if you will. This is one of the most famous features in the entire series and defines Silent Hill as a town with a mind of its own. But I wanted to save this one for the end as it impacts everything we've covered previously. In stark contrast with the Fog World, as it's commonly referred to, where it's only dark inside of the buildings, in the Otherworld everything is dark, even the overworld. The aesthetics become that of rust, blood and iron, the atmosphere shifts from desolate to hellish industrial madness, enemies are stronger and more plentiful, and this is usually also where the boss fight takes place. In Silent Hill 2, the Otherworld is a little less extreme, and a bit gloomier with somewhat darker, cooler colors with more blues and greens involved. The transition to the Otherworld generally signifies the halfway point of the dungeon. What this parallel dimension does is essentially double the size of each dungeon. And yes, most of these areas have a Fog World and an Otherworld equivalent. The layout of the area generally stays the same with some minor differences. However, doors that were previously locked or jammed can now sometimes be accessible and vice versa. In some ways you could compare this to the Dark World in A Link to the Past, a dark reflection of the Light World. However, the big difference being that in A Link to the Past you have control over it. In the light world, you are restricted to portals, but in the dark world, you have the option to travel back with the magic mirror at any time. Silent Hill Origins, the first game to be developed outside of Japan, experimented with a similar technique that gives the player the option to transition to the other world at will by the use of mirrors. In this case, the mirrors are stationary and not something you can carry with you. In the games from the Team Silent era, you have no control over which dimension you visit. Once you transition to the other world, it takes a while before you return to the fog world. This is not a decision that is up to you. I personally like this approach to the other world the most, as it creates an oppressive feeling of something that is out of your control, an external factor or presence that pulls the strings, which is regarded to be the town of Silent Hill itself. When the choice to transition between dimensions is handed to the player, it doesn't have the same effect anymore. It can present some new puzzle opportunities, yes, but in my opinion it's not worth sacrificing that which makes the game so great in the first place: its unique and foreboding atmosphere. Puzzles based on dimension shifting and stuff like that is better reserved for other types of games. If you've never played a Silent Hill game, perhaps you would consider picking one up sometime. If of course you can deal with the themes of horror. If you're afraid of jump scares, don't worry. There are some mild jump scares, but they are very scarce and well spaced out. Silent Hill is all about psychological horror and doesn't bombard you with obnoxiously loud sounds and imagery. Anyway, I'm still hoping for the day that Silent Hill will return to its glory days. We got so close with PT, which was supposed to be a tease for a brand new Japanese title. But alas, it wasn't meant to be. But there is always hope. I want to personally thank Scribe for giving me permission to use his footage from his Let's Plays. I know that some people prefer to watch someone else play a horror game rather than playing it themselves. In that case, I highly recommend watching his videos. He has playlists of him playing through Silent Hill 1, 2, 3, and even some of the Western games. He also doesn't just run through, but rather takes his time to explain some of the lore, the development cycle, symbolism, and anything else that makes the game so interesting. For next week, I'm looking to see if I can give a shot at some lore in Zelda. Yeah, that will go well. I also have some other scripts and ideas floating around, so I will make sure to get on those as quickly as possible. As always, if you like my content, do the thing with the button and the bell, stuff like that. You know what I'm talking about. This is Don signing off, and have a good one.